Welcome to Who Runs This Park, a podcast where you are invited into the hearts and stories of those who have committed their careers to the protection and preservation of our great national parks. Who Runs This Park aims to be a catalyst for inspiration, highlighting all that goes into managing our national parks and building a sense of appreciation for the invaluable beauty, diversity, and history of our protected lands. There are not many folks whose commute into work is via plane, but for Susanne, this is quite normal. How? Susanne is the superintendent of Lake Clark National Park and Preserve, and this national park is accessible only by plane, with a few access points via the ocean, but there are no roads, so how Susanne gets into work is by plane. And, well, to mention, she's also spent a lot of time around coastal brown bears, which, if you don't know what they are, you should definitely look them up because, for context, they can be up to 9 feet tall and are a little scary. So, just an FYI. In our episode today, we get to talk to Susanne Fleek-Green, the Alaska native who has been superintendent of Lake Clark since 2017 and whose passion for environmental and public land protection, woman empowerment, and native rights is evident. In today's episode, she shares her experience from working in Congress to working as chief of staff in Anchorage, and to now getting to steward and protect a park that highlights the grandeur of Alaska. This is a good one. So let's jump in. Susanne, welcome to Who Runs This Park. It's a joy to have you here today.
It's great to join you. Thank you so much for your interest in Lake Clark.
Yeah, of course. A way that I like to start these conversations off is just by sharing and highlighting some of the unique experiences that each of the superintendents have from their tenure. So I'd love to hear, kind of as we dive into things and maybe spark ideas of where the conversation can go, what have been some of the more unique situations you've experienced while working as superintendent?
Well, I've been lucky to have many, so it's hard to narrow it down for just a
of
few.
course.
I feel incredibly lucky, to be honest, that this is my daily work and the things involved in that. So even a basic thing like I'm based out of Anchorage, but the park is about 100 miles to the west here, and you get there by small plane. So when I go to the park, my commute, so to speak, is by small plane, and it is always amazing the vista that you have when you're doing that commute. And so, every time there's, you're going over the west coast of Cook Inlet and past two just absolutely stunning, magnificent volcanoes that are within the park, and then traveling through Lake Clark Pass and seeing the mountain glaciers, and then descending in, always with a little bit of a bump or two from the turbulence, descending into Lake Clark itself, or as we call it, Kijikvina, which means a place where people gather. So that's the Dena'ina name for Lake Clark that we use. So it's not so unique because that is my commute to get to the park, but it's always amazing and takes your breath away. But even that said, I still, as someone who is from Alaska, and I've had many great experiences across Alaska, Lake Clark, I think is really special because it is a microcosm of Alaska. You get a little bit of everything. You have just high peaks, you have turquoise mountain lakes, you have the coastal brown bears, you have a little bit of everything. It's really a place where a lot of different ecosystems in Alaska sort of blend, and also where people blend, right? So we have Dena'ina people, we have Utic, we have Alutiiq descent, which makes it an incredible place to work when you are working with all those different cultures and perspectives. But then also, yes, I get to do amazing things. Like I have to say, landing on the coast and spending time very close to our coastal brown bears always is a little bit unnerving and yet amazing. Luckily, I get to go with highly skilled people, our bear biologists, our rangers that are out there, because you do get very close to these giant animals, within 6, 7, 8 feet that you always feel a little bit nervous about. But it is a very unique experience that I get to have routinely, and that visitors to the park get to have, that is a once in a lifetime trip. So I do that. But then also I think about hiking the Talakwana Trail, which I've done a couple of different segments of it, but you're in the high alpine. And one trip we did coming out of Talakwana Lake to Turquoise Lake and hiking over places where Dena'ina people have hiked and traversed for thousands of years. And
Wow.
so you feel like you are in the wilderness and alone, but you know that you are not. And just
Hmm.
understanding the landscape that is giant in scale and yet helps connect you to the people that have come before is an amazing
Right.
experience. And then dropping into Turquoise Lake, which is exactly that. It's just this stunning turquoise lake with these rock forms that come out of nowhere. And you're like, what has the ice age left us
Yeah.
here at Turquoise Lake? So those type of experiences where you get to go with other staff, the wonderful people I work with here at Lake Clark, that really connects you to the land and sort of recharges your batteries to do the
Right.
work that we come into the office for every day. So getting
Yeah.
the blend of those type of experiences is really rewarding and, like I said, recharging.
Yeah, I mean, definitely having driven to this podcast recording studio, I think it's quite unique to have your commute be an airplane. I have a couple, I mean, all super interesting in a couple areas that I'm curious about. So with the bears specifically, what are you usually
Doing.
doing? Yeah, like
Why are we so close to
why are
those
you so
bears?
close to said bears? Yeah,
So
exactly.
part of the park is on the west side of Cook Inlet, which is across from Anchorage. So it's
Okay.
interesting that you get to this very remote place where you feel remote, and yet it's not actually that far from Anchorage, Alaska's biggest city. And so it's also our highest visitor destination is
Right.
along that coast because we have amazing habitat for coastal brown bears between the sedge meadows and the salmon runs. You
Okay.
get to see coastal brown bears in a wild place. So we go out there. We have 2 ranger stations.
And the brown bears are the huge ones, right? They're like the
Correct.
Kodiak
Yes,
bears.
correct. They're big, and part of that is coastal brown bears versus interior brown bears, which people usually refer to the interior ones as grizzlies. The coastal brown bears are well fed. They are healthy because they
Oh,
have a lot
interesting.
of different food sources, and they will come and congregate in places where the salmon are running, where there's healthy
Okay.
sedge meadows. And so there's really good food sources for them. And we're
Oh,
learning more and more how someone recently referred to it as the conveyor belt. So they, between the nearshore marine environment and then the terrestrial environment of the park. And so bears utilize a lot of those marine resources as well. We now know that they catch sea otters and
really?
they will take food that is available to them. So they're
Wow.
catching sea otters. We know that they catch
They're catching
seals.
anything. Oh my gosh.
Along our coast, there's also a healthier clam population. And so they're digging for clams, which is also amazing to
Oh,
watch. Bears go out on these big tidal flats and dig for clams, which seems like a lot of work for a little bit of food, but they get a lot. And it sort of
yeah.
balances out their diet between fish runs, is that they're able to go get those
Oh,
clams.
interesting.
They get a lot of protein from the sedge meadows. So the Bear Coast, which really
Okay.
extends along that west side of Cook Inlet, you'll see not only on the Lake Clark coast, but also the McNeil River area, which is run by the state of Alaska, and then the Katmai coast in Katmai National Park. That
Right.
whole intact ecosystem provides really good habitat for what is a very healthy brown bear population.
Oh, good to know. And so, like you said, in this area where you usually are, in these close proximities to bears, there's 2 ranger stations you mentioned?
Right. So we have 2 ranger stations, and we have some great rangers that come back year after year. And I'm always amazed, mostly by these women. We have some great women rangers that are out there for the most part by themselves, interacting with visitors and educating visitors on brown bears and other aspects of the coastline, and really living by themselves for a long period
Wow.
of time. Just amazing people that
Yeah, that's
come and
awesome.
work for the park year after year that make us such a strong park, I believe, is that we have that kind of staff stability.
Yeah, that's
So, yeah, we
awesome.
have 2 ranger stations, and then we also, going back to unique experiences, we have a park boat called the Chigmit
Okay.
that we take back and forth across Cook Inlet and do patrols and do a lot of our work because we have to supply and maintain those coastal ranger cabins. So
Okay.
we have our park boat, and that in and of itself, going across Cook Inlet where you have very strong tides, is an experience that
Yeah.
not many Alaskans or non-Alaskans get to enjoy. And so that's something that I've gotten to do a couple of times, and it's always pretty amazing.
Are you when you fly in, is there like an airfield? I don't know, is it a seaplane? Is it a how are you landing?
Great question. Depends where I am going. So we have our
Okay.
field headquarters in the community of Port Ellsworth, and there is a airstrip there that we land on. But then we go to a number of other places in the park. So when we go to the coast, if we're not on the boat, we're landing on the beach in the park plane, and that's how most of our visitors get there, as well as landing
Is there
on
a strip on the beach?
no.
Oh,
You're landing on the beach. And so,
okay.
again, you really have to be cognizant of the weather and
Right.
the tide and how big the tide is so you know how much time you can stay on the beach. There's highly skilled people, again, that work for the park that understand all these dynamics that ensure that we have safe operations on
Right.
our coast. And then we also have some ranger stations that are on lakes where we do fly in a float plane to get our staff out there and resupply them
Okay.
and do maintenance. So yeah, we have no
Oh my
roads.
gosh.
We have no roads. So
Huh.
you have to really be creative and thoughtful about how you're going to access different
Right.
parts of the park and doing so in a safe manner.
So, can people access the park by boat also, or is
Yes, but really only on the coast. So there are a couple of commercial operators that will take
okay?
people across Cook Inlet in a boat versus an airplane. But the vast majority of people come by small airplane.
Wow, yeah, and that, I mean, I'm just thinking of, say you're camping or backpacking and you brought food for, there's just a lot of factors you have to think about because, you have to almost have backup food in the case that you can't get out for weather reasons the day you would plan to get out or something like that.
Yes, you absolutely have to have backup food. We tell our staff that when they're going into the backcountry that they have to take days worth of backup food because we've gone a week or longer where weather or other factors
Oh my
prevent us from
gosh.
getting to our staff that are in the field. So yeah, you have to build that in. But overall in Alaska, that would be true for a lot of places that you go off the road system in Alaska is that you have to think different in terms of how you prepare for it because once you get out there, it's
You're out there.
self-reliance. You are responsible for yourself and you very well could go days before a plane can come back and get you.
Yeah, that's one of the hopes I have to do. So, you're familiar with Knowles?
Yes.
Yeah, so I did a backcountry ski trip with them earlier this year, actually, but
Mhm.
that was how I like first did a first aid training with them, and that's how I found out about them. But they have these 30-day expeditions in Alaska, and I remember first looking at the website, and I was like, because my backcountry ski trip that I did, it was an alumni trip, they're a little bit shorter in duration typically, and I was an alumni because I had done the first aid wilderness training. But yeah, it's amazing of these just to be out in the wilderness for 30 days. And then I'm sure people who are going through Lake Clark are going on expeditions longer than that and just out in the wilderness for extended periods of time. And I'm impressed by situations where people have to, they planned to go for a day and they had to be there for a week because of weather. It's a very different mindset than me having lived between like Austin and New York City. Those places are not in that mindset at all, especially New York. It's,
Yeah.
telling someone you have to wait a week. They're like, no, that's not happening. It's not allowed.
Yeah, it is a different mindset. There's an Alaska term, skookum. Like, hey, that person's really skookum, which means they're tough and they can handle it. And
Oh, that's
I
awesome.
think a lot about our staff, and our staff is really skookum in that it takes a different type of person that has those skills as well as that willingness to
Right.
go out and either be by yourself or be with only a few other people spending time in such remote and challenging locations. But
Yeah.
then for that reason too, it's so rewarding. You learn
Right.
something about yourself when you're able to do that. And when you think about the people that have been on the land for thousands of years, again, this was their life. This is their life. They have those innate skills that are so important in Alaska, because it means survival. And those indigenous people have shared their knowledge so that more people coming to Alaska can also be in these really special places and survive and stay.
Yeah. I want to circle back to we got, there's so many exciting things to dive into, but we got sidetracked of I'm still curious how you were so close to these bears.
Oh,
Um
yeah. Well, the bears go where the bears want to go. So when we're at these ranger cabins and, you can be walking down the beach, you can be walking down a trail and, again, bears go where they want to go
yeah.
and you stay in place so that they don't
Yeah.
think that you're fun and interesting and they
Yeah.
will come very close to you
Oh my
because
gosh.
again, they're pretty well fed. Like they're focused on getting their food. So, and at these locations, there's good food sources. So
Right.
you watch them go by. Um, and again, it's we have great rangers that keep everybody safe, but it's
Yeah.
a special experience to know that you are in their place and you're an observant person there and you are
Mhm.
watching them. And for the most part, if you do not approach them, if you respect them, it can be a very safe experience. And again, once in a lifetime for many, many people that come to the park.
Yeah, I got like a super small taste of that. I was doing a hike in Glacier with some friends and we ended up this huge group of people because we kept getting stuck, but we essentially were like not cornered, but a bighorn sheep were on like both sides of the group. And it's just, I mean, there's nothing you just have to wait.
Yeah.
You're not going to try to like rustle their feathers. And this is still a wild and could be a dangerous animal. But yeah, that was my small taste into, I would imagine I would be feeling even more alert if it was a larger animal. I was
Yes.
like, okay, cool. Yep. You have the right of way. We're just going to wait here. We
We're just
don't
going
need
to
to go
wait.
anywhere.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Man. Well, you had mentioned that you grew up in Alaska. So I'd love to hear kind of what that experience was like for you. And in preparing for this, I know you spent some time in DC and then I think you went to school down in California. So what drew you back to Alaska?
Well, I would say there was never a question of me being in Alaska. I tell people I sort of took side trips and detours, but I always knew that I would be back in Alaska
Okay.
because this is where my family is. This is the place that I feel comfortable and at home. And so there's never a question that I was coming back. And I always had a connection to some of the public land issues that were being
Okay.
debated in Alaska. And, I grew up, I was born in Juneau, but I always tell people we lived in Yakutat and my mom went
Okay.
to Juneau to have babies. And so I lived in Yakutat, I lived in King Salmon, but mostly I grew up in Anchorage. But I was very lucky that my parents are both from Southeast Alaska. And so there
Okay.
was always trips to Southeast to visit friends and family. So I had a connection and still have a very strong connection to that place. My father still lives in Southeast Alaska. But even growing up in Anchorage, my parents explored. My dad actually worked for the state of Alaska and he was a Fish and Wildlife Protection Officer
Oh, cool.
and worked in the Lake Clark area, but also he was a pilot. He was a bush pilot. And so we got out of Anchorage a lot. It was not unusual that we would go to other places around Alaska. So I'm very fortunate growing up in the urban environment of Anchorage that I still got out a lot and really,
Right.
I think, learned an appreciation from both of my parents about the diverse cultures of Alaska and how important protecting public lands is. So my dad, again, worked for the state, and I was really coming of age during the debate over ANILCA, which is the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. which
Okay.
created Lake
Oh,
Clark National Park.
that's the acronym for
Yes,
that.
Anilka.
Oh.
So that was
Oh
a
my gosh.
big debate
Yeah.
before and after, and it was a really hard debate, even as a kid, to listen to and see that animosity amongst Alaskans about
Yeah.
whether or not Anilka was a good thing to do. And certainly its implementation was not always smooth. And it means that parks like Lake Clark are still really young parks when you think
Right.
about it, in compared to the Yellowstones or the Yosemites. We're still a young park. We're still figuring out our way. And so growing up, I had an appreciation for public lands, but not necessarily federal public lands.
Yeah.
I heard those own debates in my own house
Right.
versus out in the public. And so I grew up thinking a lot about what it meant and how, in the face of really quick development in Alaska. So also growing up at the beginning of the oil boom and what that meant for
Mm.
developing Alaska, how those two things intersected, and how we protect special places not only because of their natural and cultural resources, but because of what they mean, again, to the first Alaskans, to the indigenous, that these were lands where they go subsistence, hunt, and fish. And so public lands are critically important, I think, especially now in the face of climate change, to try and ensure that we do as much as we can to make sure those resources are still there 40, 50 years from now, because as go the resources, go our people, right? And
Yeah.
whether or not we are able to continue ways of life that are so central to what it means to be in Alaska. And I think especially for indigenous people, what it means to interact with the land. And so I always wanted to go into public lands. And so that drew me to the graduate program that I ended up doing in California. And then that drew me to DC, where I started my real career. I had many Alaska odd jobs in the
Right.
summers.
Yeah.
You know, I did the gamut of Alaska.
But a young working professional.
Not so. I mean, I worked in a logging camp. I worked on the North Slope. I counted fish, where I was just pretty much covered with slime for an
Oh
entire
my gosh.
summer. So I did all those Alaska
Yeah.
jobs, and then went to DC and started working for Department of the Interior in the Office of Policy Analysis. And so that really got me started and got me hooked, I think, even more about how we can turn down the temperature in Alaska on the debate over public lands. You know, how we resolve some of these issues so that we have a balanced approach, so that I hope we put some of these debates behind us and we have a collective understanding of the importance of protecting these areas. And when I say protect, I do not mean close off. I do not mean,
Right.
putting up walls and closing the borders, which people think about with national parks. In
Right.
Alaska, under Anilka, parks are different, right? We don't have gates. Lake Clark National Park was created because of the great natural resources, and that we are the headwaters of the famed Bristol Bay salmon run. But that is also because the boundary of the park also encompasses all these subsistence resources. And
Right.
so I always think that our first responsibility is to ensure, again, that those subsistence resources are healthy and vibrant and
Right.
accessible to the indigenous people. So that's, my time in DC, I always came back to that. And I always tried to find a way that whatever job I was in, I was still connecting in some way to those Alaska issues.
So when you were, I guess, going off of that, did you find yourself, during the Presidential Management Fellowship with the Department of the Interior and other positions you had in DC, did you specialize or try to focus on Alaska-based conversations? Or was it like sometimes, it was out of your control and you were doing other things and stuff like that?
Yes. So when you're young like that, you pretty much do what your boss tells you. But you also, I always tell people coming in and starting their careers that you have to be your own best advocate.
Yes. Yeah.
To make sure you're blending in some of the things that really give you satisfaction, as well as
Right.
what you were hired to do. So I was always fortunate that I found jobs and people to work for that helped me keep that blend. But mostly, it was about public lands and land conservation. So when I was working at Department of the Interior, it was right after NAFTA passed. So actually, most of what I worked on was implementation
Oh,
of the environmental side agreements, NAFTA, which for
oh,
a kid from
interesting.
Alaska was an amazing experience. Something
Yeah.
I never thought my career would have had me do, but it really still taught me how it gave me a really good view of all the federal agencies that were engaged in conservation. So worked on the US Mexico border and worked with national parks along the border on just things like migratory birds. And then when I went to Capitol Hill, which one often does when you work in Washington
I feel
D.C.
like it's like the like pilgrimage to Capitol Hill.
It is. It's a big beacon that, it was an amazing experience. Again, I got to work for Senator Patrick Leahy, who is an incredible person and has been involved in so many of the environmental milestones that our
Mm.
country has gone through over the last 50 years. So they gave this Alaska kid a chance
Yeah.
to
It's
work
awesome.
on Vermont and national environmental issues. So I still was working on public lands for the most part, public lands in Vermont. So the Green Mountain National Forest, the Silvio Conte National Wildlife Refuge. So I was working on public lands, but from a different perspective. And then every once in a while, Senator Leahy did let me work on Alaska issues. So that was great. And a lot of those Alaska issues intersected with how people access national
Right.
parks here.
Right.
So it was an amazing experience.
Yeah, that's really cool.
I was definitely one of those people. I was going to go to DC for 2 years and move home, and then there's just amazing job opportunities that are very
Yeah.
rewarding there. So stayed for a little bit longer than I thought I would.
Yeah, sounds like it worked out. And I think it's cool to have that context, like if preserving and protecting the environment and discerning what that means in the different contexts, like having the experience of knowing essentially what you're working with. Like, what are the constraints within the government? What are the different programs? What are the different groups that are invested in this? And I think it probably helped you be more effective in just like your leadership and just in all the different areas you got involved in after that time period, kind of having that context and knowledge of how it all works. And
Yeah.
I'm like seeing, I mean, even as I've been having these conversations, like it is complicated. There is just a lot going on everywhere and all the different parks and all the way from, I was just talking with the superintendent at Voyageurs National Park in Minnesota. And, they had this whole situation where they were helping Isle Royal regenerate their wolf population. And so they're picking out wolves from their park and their boundary areas to like help start the population there. And so it's just, I mean, I feel like so many people, myself included, I like go to the national parks as this place of beauty and rest, and my appreciation for everything that is being done and how much work it takes to fight to protect these in a sense, sometimes probably easier than others, but it's been awesome learning about it. So it's cool to hear your experience on the more like governmental side in DC itself.
Yeah, and I will say, I spent 10 years in DC, and I always tell people that if it wasn't for the public lands and the public places that I could get to near DC, I'm sure I would have been gone much sooner than I was. Yeah. But in an urban place like that, still being able to get to Great Falls or being able to get to the Shenandoahs, places that are protected and that even that close to Washington, D.C., places of solitude where you could go and escape a little bit and enjoy the outdoors and sort of revive yourself. Those kept me sane. And all those times when it was really hot and really muggy and really crowded, I knew that I could get in my car and go kayak on the Potomac River and it would sort of revive me. So I think it's amazing within the national park system, the diversity of places and where people find their ability to recharge. Because for some, it might be a historic site, a historic house that tells you a story of an amazing person, amazing people, or it might be a place of grandeur like Yellowstone or Yosemite that helps you do that. And so I always tell people there's the national parks, But then there's the national park system
Hmm.
that is preserving and protecting all these truly amazing places and stories.
Yeah. I know that while you were in DC, so you spent time working for Senator Patrick Leahy and then went to work for the Environmental Working Group. I'd love to hear what that was like and how that work differed from some of the other stuff you had been doing.
Well, working for Senator Leahy, again, I got to work on public land issues, but I also worked on private land conservation, and he was very
Oh,
active
really?
on, and in fact, he really was the person that helped develop the conservation title of the Farm Bill, which I won't go down that rabbit hole, but a really important piece of the fabric of conservation of lands in the United States that people don't think about a lot is how we help private landowners protect the resources of their
Oh,
land
yeah.
while
I
they
didn't know
stay in
about that.
private ownership. So I got to work on that. And I always tell people it was funny because, again, growing up in Alaska, I had barely even seen a farm, much less
Right.
understood farm policy. But Senator Leahy, one of the great things about him and his staff is they were willing to give you a try and they would
Right.
guide you through it. And there was a high level of trust, which again, thinking about myself way back then, I don't know what they were thinking, but they were
Yeah.
thinking that I cared about these things. Yeah, so I spent a good bit of time doing that for Senator Leahy and then went to work for Environmental Working Group on the same set of issues is how do we create incentives for private landowners to conserve the resources of their land while they're still getting some economic value from it?
Right.
So, for example, conservation easements on farmland that are threatened by urban suburban growth is how can we create incentives for those landowners to still have working farms but protect them from development pressure. So that too was really satisfying. And now, all these years later, being in Alaska, we have Alaska Farmland Trust that does the same
Oh,
here.
cool.
So that was great. And again, you learn that across the United States, there's a whole toolbox of ways that we can conserve these resources. So while I work on public lands, that's not the only way that we can do it. And it's, again, in the face of climate change, it's going to take all the tools in the
Yeah.
toolbox to be
You will be
effective.
busy. Yeah. I love hearing kind of about just the different facets of, I want to say the government, but it's like, I guess it's all related to the government, but it's cool to learn about these different areas. One thing, pivoting a little bit, but one thing I saw in preparing for the interview is it seems that you do have a real passion for building up outdoor leadership skills in young women and in people in general. And I'd love to hear where that passion came from, how that passion becomes a reality in terms of like being involved in different, I know you're a member of a couple of different boards and different councils and stuff like that. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that passion.
When I think about where it came from, I really have to look to my mother, who is amazing in many ways, but also, she, when I was growing up, was and still is a runner. So she did marathons, but also, she would go and just hike mountains. And not even hike, she would run up mountains, and
Oh my gosh.
still does these things. And it never was daunting to her. There
Yeah.
wasn't sort of the, oh, am I safe? Should I go do that? Would just go do it. And so she really transferred to my sisters and I think that level of comfort, sometimes not well founded. Um,
You're like,
we did,
sometimes we have too much
yeah.
confidence.
Sometimes we maybe we're not as prepared as we should have been, but the confidence to go and do it
Right.
and explore and know that we could do it by ourselves. And so when I look at young women and girls now, especially being here in Alaska, when these resources are just a 15-minute drive, a 10-minute
Yeah.
drive, you want to go to the mountains, helping young women find that confidence in themselves and helping them gain the skills so that they can be confident and be
Yeah.
safe. It's incredibly rewarding. And I think I want to see more women out there doing that. And there's so many different ways to recreate in Alaska now. And so I feel like there's evolving skills that you can
Right.
gain to be able to access these places. And especially being in a place like Anchorage, it's pretty urban, but again, those amazing places are really just outside our door. And I think for your mental health, you need to be able to go get them.
Yeah.
Often think about like people that live in Alaska and don't do those things. And so helping young women gain those skills again is just really rewarding. And so that's something that I have tried to, in my personal time, build up
Yeah.
those women. And there's other great programs, there's a
Yeah.
large community of women supporting women in the outdoors
Right.
here. So that's incredible.
Well, and I would say like two kind of thoughts with that. The first is in some of the adventures that I've had, like there have honestly, candidly been moments where I've been more scared than I've ever been outside of just like normal life. But then, and some of it is like learning when to be scared. Like,
Right.
I don't know, you want to be aware and alert. But for me personally, especially I was learning how to backcountry ski and like I was just like, everywhere is dangerous. Avalanches are for me, it was a practice of learning what is a real sign that we should be concerned about and what is just part of being out there in those conditions. But I think the confidence that I've personally experienced from some of these overcoming that fear or overcoming those moments where it was scary or it was like, you were out of your comfort zone, I think has built me up more than like I don't want to say in a more effective way, but it's just, I don't know if other things have replicated that. So that's been really cool.
Yeah. And I think too, from my own experience, but when I watch other people, I think one of the great things is that confidence can transfer to other parts of your life. So when you're gaining it and you know that you can be self-reliant in the outdoors, that transfers to other parts of your life. And so again, young women and young men too, I see the same, right? Is building skills in both sets, but that they take that confidence into other arenas at a critical point in their lives, right?
Yeah.
Being a teenager is hard no matter what. So if you're
Yeah,
able to
exactly.
build up confidence through being in the outdoors and being self-reliant, fantastic. That
Yeah.
is going to help people in so many different ways. And so I think programs that help get people into national parks, national
Right.
forests, wildlife refuges are an amazing investment because it will change someone's life. Right.
Yeah.
It really will. It has lifelong benefits that when they go places, they have that level of confidence. Plus, again, those places of solace where you can get away is really important when you're living in urban environments.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's something with these programs. I think coolest thing is giving people the choice of like, maybe they actually decide that they don't like camping, but not ever camping or not ever going hiking because you don't feel comfortable doing it or don't have the resources or don't have the opportunity to. I think empowering people to be like, oh, you know what, I actually really like this and I tried it. I didn't think I would. Or like, you know what, I tried it. There were some cool aspects. I gained some confidence in X, Y, and Z, but it's not for me. But like they've at least been able to and be exposed to it to make that decision rather than never getting that chance.
And I think, again, for national parks, we think about that spectrum of recreational opportunities is you can have sort of beginner kayaking experiences or beginner hikes, places that are safer, and then go up the ladder and learn things about yourselves. Like I always tell people, I'm about a 3-night backpacker. I love to backpack, but that's about my limit. I will never
Yeah.
hike. I will never be an Appalachian Trail through hiker. That is not
Yeah,
my
you know.
level of enjoyment. But I know that about myself. And so when I think about trips that I want to do, that's about it. That's what I
Yeah.
want to do. So people find those things out about themselves. They sort of test the boundaries for themselves. And national parks, forests, etc., are great places to do that.
Yeah. Before we jump into more like things specifically about Lake Clark, I know also in my research, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you are a tribal member of the Central Council of Tlingit Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska, and then also a Sea Alaska shareholder.
Correct.
So I would love to learn what that entails and how that affects you from like a both personal and professional perspective.
Yes, I am a tribal citizen of Tlingit Haida, and it is a regional tribal entity. And I think
Okay.
coming into a position like this, growing up in that area and sort of understanding what it means to be a tribal citizen helps me today in my job. But I understand that government to government relationship. I understand the sovereign nature of a tribe and the
Right.
responsibilities that a tribe has to its citizens. And again, that is on an equal footing with the United States. And so we have, as managers of these lands, we have a responsibility to have that government to government relationship with tribes, that it should be ingrained in what we do and how we approach issues. And so having that background, I think, just means it wasn't a learning curve for me. I came
Right.
into the
Right.
job understanding that that is how we should be working with the tribes in the region around Lake Clark, and how that really, again, the responsibility that we have is to work with side by side with those tribes and tribal members to develop how we manage the park's resources, how it drives our research budget, how it
Right.
drives what we're doing on cultural resources and how we're protecting those cultural resources, how we're interpreting those stories that
Mhm.
are not ours. So I'm Tlingit. I am not Dena'ina. Those are not my stories to tell. So how do we work with the Dena'ina people in those tribes to tell those
Mhm.
stories? They might have taken place on the lands that are now Lake Clark National Park, but that doesn't mean that they're not Dena'ina lands any longer just because Congress drew a line around them at some point.
Right.
So I think me growing up as a tribal citizen helped influence how I approach the management of
Yeah.
these resources. And then being a Sea Alaska shareholder is something very different, right? That's the Alaska Native Regional and Village Corporations were created as part of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. So we did things differently here in Alaska. And I think for me, it is watching the progress that Sea Alaska has made over the past decades in how it manages its own lands. So earlier I said I worked in a logging camp for a summer. That was for Sea Alaska. Sea Alaska was cutting the timber on its land. And now it has created this, along with Tlingit Haida and the Tongass National Forest, this amazing new Forest Guardians program that is focused on co-stewardship of lands within the Tongass National Forest with Indigenous people and bring those Indigenous values. So I'm very proud of the fact that Sea Alaska is one of the partners in that.
Okay.
It
Cool.
also, when I finished college, I went and interned for a summer for Sea Alaska. And it just happened to be the summer that our state legislature was debating whether or not there should be an amendment to the Alaska State Constitution for a rural resident preference for subsistence, for hunting and fishing. And so my boss, again, I've been very fortunate to have wonderful bosses in my career and really mentors.
That helps for sure.
But he sent me to Juneau to watch
Okay.
the debate. And
Wow. As an
honestly,
intern, that's so
as an
cool.
intern, yes, it was great. And so, to me, that was really the intersection of politics and policy. And the legislature did not put on the ballot a constitutional amendment. And we still, for decades since, have been debating this issue. And
Okay.
we have not resolved it. And so it was great being there and listening to that debate and really hearing people testify about why it would have been a critical amendment to the Constitution. And so I think Sea Alaska is also very good at giving its young people those kind of opportunities. And so now when I come to the park, fast forward, it really, again, how we grow, how we support, how we develop places that are welcoming and inclusive so that
Mhm.
Indigenous people can work in national parks and can,
Mhm.
really either work in or work side by side, because we are going towards co-stewardship of
Mhm.
national parks because they have such a unique perspective. I would
Right.
say, especially here in Alaska, because I know Alaska, that really tapping into that Indigenous knowledge, that local knowledge, those skills add so much value to how we manage public lands in Alaska. So, again, I see both from a tribal perspective and from corporate native corporation shareholder perspective how they have both come together to try and build up, rebuild. People have always had this ability to manage these lands that,
Yeah.
again, at least for Lake Clark, these are Dena'ina lands that we are managing. So we have to find these areas for partnership and
Yeah, absolutely.
respecting the knowledge of the first people of these lands.
Do you have any things that come to mind? You had mentioned, you working and sharing knowledge from these indigenous peoples and kind of that helping dictate how you manage some of the Alaska lands. Do you have any examples or things that come to mind of like, oh my gosh, yeah, when we learned this or talked about this, it changed how we went about this?
So when this park was created, it also created our Subsistence Resource Commission. So we have representatives from the different communities around Lake Clark, and we meet frequently and ask them for what their concerns are, places where they would like more information, and
Right.
that drives a lot of our research program. So an example is a couple of years ago, we have an increase in the beaver population by Kijakvina, Lake Clark again, using the Dena'ina name. And so we started based on the concerns about water quality, again, from our subsistence users, water quality changes based on the proliferation of beaver dams in an important watershed. We created a research program to look into that and then go back to our subsistence users and talk about what we have learned. We also have had a long-term fish monitoring station on the New Halen River. And so we are counting the salmon that come all the way up from Bristol Bay along the Kwijak River and then into Lake Clark. And so counting those fish and understanding what the run size is, when the run is. And again, that is such an important resource for the people around Lake Iliamna and Lake Clark, and huge part of their subsistence life. That, again, especially in the face of climate change, how we think about what we do to protect the headwaters of that Bristol Bay sockeye run. And that program, I will say, was done right when it was started because...
Oh, nice. You love to hear that.
Yes. The people that started it went and spoke with the tribal members and talked about the salmon population in the salmon run before we started the research project and to find out not only what was important, but also their indigenous knowledge of the salmon runs was so much more than we knew at the time.
Yeah.
So being able to use that, I mean, frankly, in so many ways, it gives us a head start on the science because this is thousands of years of knowledge of the resources that they are generous enough to share with us at the park. And so that's another example of relationship and being able to look at our research programs and how we manage those resources based on the tribal communities that we're working with.
Is there commercial fishing? And this part has been interesting, again, because I was just talking to voyagers, like pretty near voyagers is like there's a lumber business and so kind of understanding how in some of these different parks, there are places where the resources are used for commercial purposes, maybe outside the park boundaries. But what does that interplay look like with Lake Clark? Are people fishing within Lake Clark? Are they fishing or within Bristol Bay?
Well, Bristol Bay, huge sockeye salmon fishery that is a commercial fishery.
Okay.
People do not commercial fish in Lake Clark, but they absolutely fish, right? Again, one of the great things about Anilka is that it is fully accessible for Alaskans and visitors alike to come and fish. And so, yes, it's not commercial, but it is fishing. And then on the Cook Inlet side, just offshore of Lake Clark, there is commercial fishing. So we frequently see commercial fishing boats right along the shoreline there. So that does take place, which it's a great question because not only are these fish of great sort of subsistence and recreational value, but they are of commercial economic value as well. Mm-hmm. So being able to relate to folks and tell the story about how they are used and produce economic value is important as well. I think people don't always understand that is in protecting the headwaters, we are also protecting the fishery for its commercial use as well as its subsistence use.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said this earlier in our conversation, but by protecting the resources, you're also protecting the people that like utilize those resources, and whether that's the indigenous peoples that live on the land and live and integrate that way, or even, yeah, like you said, the different industries that provide the economic value to those areas.
Right. And for Lake Clark, we also, like I said, there's no roads. So most people
So crazy. Oh my
come in
gosh.
by small airplane. And so it also means that most of our visitors are coming with a commercial guide. And so the
Mm,
economic value of protecting the resources along the Cook Inlet coast directly translates into an economic value. There are, we have over 100 commercial operators that work in the park and are bringing visitors to the park mostly to see those amazing coastal brown bears and photography and sport fishing. So there's an economic value there as well.
right.
And those commercial operators are from Anchorage and then down the Kenai Peninsula in a number of those communities. And so we do think a lot about management changes that we are making, and we are directed to think about the protection of the natural and cultural resources, but
Right.
we are cognizant that there are many, many, many businesses, sometimes many that are just mom and pop businesses that are relying on those resources for their business, for their
Right.
economic benefit. So we do think about that.
Yeah, one thing I've wondered is, have you considered getting your pilot license given your new commute? Or not new, I guess you've been there for a good amount of years now.
I have not thought about getting my pilot's license since I was 18. I thought about it a lot because, again, my dad was a bush pilot, and
Right.
it really expands your ability to get out into Alaska. But haven't thought about it since then, because what I know is I want to fly with a really good pilot, which means they have a lot more hours in a plane than I do. So I am very happy at this point in my life to fly with a really good pilot versus thinking that I'm going to fly a plane myself.
Yeah, I think I would be okay with that also. At this moment, I don't need that, but who knows? Granted, it would probably be more convenient, or not convenient, but it would not open up the possibilities of places I could go significantly in Austin or New York unless that was like a private jet. But we're not going down that route. So
Yeah.
that's cool. So I would love to jump into it, Lake Clark, a little bit more. But what was that transition like for you going into starting to work for Lake Clark? I think your role right before that was chief of staff for
The mayor of Anchorage.
the municipal. Yes, yeah, for Anchorage.
People ask me that question, and part of me says it wasn't that hard of a transition, because when I was working for the mayor of Anchorage, many similar skills, right? You're
Yeah,
managing people, but you're working with facilities and maintenance, you're working with law enforcement, you're thinking about people's recreational opportunities. So a lot of things did translate. What appealed to me about coming to Lake Clark National Park and Preserve is that I did have a personal connection to it. It had been a
yeah,
place I had spent some time in when I was younger, but also giving me the ability to spend time and work with rural Alaskans. I really enjoy that about my job, is that I wanted to reconnect to rural Alaska. So Lake Clark gave me that, and it's one of the highlights of my job, to be honest, is being able to go and spend time in rural communities and listening to people
yeah,
and understanding, and to some extent, not fully, because again, I am not from the place. That is not my
right.
family history, but really listening and trying to work on issues, again, that drive our agenda at the park based on those local needs. So that's coming in here. Some of it translated, some of it did not. I think a lot of the logistical challenges were not surprising to me, but working with them on a daily basis is both fun and very hard. Thinking about staff safety and
Right.
wellness is a whole nother level with the park than when I was at the municipality. But other things translate too, right? Anchorage has a high visitor industry. And so knowing that industry a bit and then bringing that knowledge to the park, I think was
Right.
helpful. I think, again, being from Alaska, growing up here, seeing the debate over public lands for the last 40 years gave me a different perspective coming into the park. I already had sort of that background and that knowledge. So in some ways it was very different, and in some ways it really was not that different from my previous job.
As you mentioned, there are no roads in Lake Clark. Where are these rural communities situated? Like, are they not accessible by roads, or are they also they are accessible by roads, but then to access the park itself, they either go via boat or plane?
Yeah, well, two things. One, not everybody has access to the park from those communities because, frankly, it's very expensive. It's expensive to get in a small plane. And so that's the other thing that we think about is how do we reconnect people to those lands when it is so expensive? But that said, most people come by boat or small plane. And those rural communities, one of the things I always tell people is that there's a series of transportation options that you have to go through to get to the park. And so just even as we think about how to get housing materials to the park, I tell people, well, first it has to come on a plane to Anchorage, and then it gets on a truck and it goes to Homer, and then it gets on a barge and goes across Cook Inlet, and then it gets on another truck and it gets to Lake Iliamna, and then it gets on another barge. And so it's multiple logistics and ways to ship things that we have to think about, which makes it really expensive to do projects in the park. And the same is true for these communities. When you think about how expensive it is to get things that we take for granted in urban areas, it's very expensive in these communities, which is why, again, protecting those subsistence resources is so important. Is we can't expect people to pay just exorbitant prices at the grocery store and not have access to these subsistence resources. We have to ensure that the resources are still there.
When you were saying that, it made me think of there was the cabin. What is it? Prenickie's cabin?
Dick Prenickie's cabin.
And so when you were talking about all the different modes of transportation, I was thinking, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that this cabin is built at Twin Lakes, which I'm assuming is a lake within the park itself.
Yes.
So, yeah, it sounds like he lived here for nearly 30 years. It sounds very remote, and I am very impressed by his ability to, in such a remote place, not only survive, but then build a shelter or a cabin in itself. So is that a place people hike to and camp at?
Yes, you can do both. Most people, again, fly in there. You can land there by float plane.
Oh, so you can land on, I guess, Twin Lakes.
Yes, his cabin is at Upper Twin Lake, and most people get there by float plane and land right on the beach, which is partly why he built the cabin there, is because it has good access. But it also makes you think this is why he built a log cabin and why he recycled a lot of the materials that he had into other tools, is because it is so expensive to get things there. And I would say, again, going back to indigenous skills and values, is that is the ultimate indigenous skill, is to recycle and reuse things in so many different ways, because you have to. And it makes life slightly more affordable. Again, it's very expensive to live in rural Alaska, but yes, that is Dick Prenicky built the cabin there, and it is a really interesting story of how he lived alone for decades and what he did and the observations that he took, and also what an advocate he was for the creation of the park and for the wilderness values that the park really represents. And the great thing is that so many people know that story and come and experience it because the park and staff long before me worked with him to preserve that cabin and still preserve the artifacts, the tools that he made while he was there.
Yeah, that's cool. Because, there is that Lake Clark is such a relatively remote park. I'd love to hear, kind of as we start to wrap up our conversation, but I'd love to hear one of the crazier situations you found yourself in said wilderness place. And that's coming from just like the curiosity of, candidly, I've never been somewhere so remote. I've read books about these places, but haven't actually experienced it.
Well, I would say, again, things that I might find more routine, other people might think, oh, that's crazy. So,
That's fair.
yeah, I would say, again, I feel like I really need to do a big shout out to the staff of the park
Yeah.
that have been here for so long and create such a great working environment. And I think that speaks to what an amazing place that it is. And so, and it also has reduced the amount of crazy things that happen because we
Yeah.
have such skilled people working for the park that understand the landscape, understand the weather, etc.
Right.
So not as many crazy things happen, but for me
Which is
at
good.
least, you definitely again, that when you go into the backcountry, like even when I went and stayed at the Upper Twin Lake Ranger cabin, what we were talking about earlier, that's exactly what happened. The weather changed and we had to spend an extra couple of days there.
Oh my gosh.
And communications, right? Like, okay, go stand on that log over there and like hold up the sat phone just to get connectivity. Is that
Yeah.
you have to sort of embrace the unknown of what you don't know what is going to happen. You might not always have that connectivity to other places. And I think from a management perspective, I'm always mindful of that when staff go into the field is you don't know what's going to happen. A volcano could erupt. That would
Oh my
mean we
gosh.
can't get our planes in the air for days. And so we can't get to our staff. A couple of years ago, we had very large wildfires outside of the park that blew smoke in, and it made us, again, we could not get to staff. And so if staff had a medical emergency, what would we do? So it really makes you think hard about what could happen that you don't know is going to happen that would create a situation like that, which just means that you take extra care before people go to the field. So it's not really sort of crazy stories, but just extra things that you need to think through before you go into the park.
Well, and I mean, you saying, I forgot in this research that this park does have active volcanoes. Like
Yes.
just, I literally have highlighted on my notes, their eruptions have been known to affect air travel due to the ash they produce. Like that is
Exactly.
crazy.
Yes.
I have been afraid of volcanoes since I was a child. So that blows my mind.
So to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. But yeah, there's so many factors. And when you're talking about the weather changing, is it usually like, I guess sometimes it's wildfire smoke, sometimes it's like ashes from eruptions, but is it more so like snow and stuff like that?
It's fog.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And again, we sort of the park and preserve cross sort of weather boundaries. So there could be fog over on Lake Clark and then clear in Anchorage, and then it flips and there's fog in Anchorage and clear. So you have to get the best of all of it. So
Yeah, right.
sometimes it's like a little weather unicorn to be able to fly. And then wildfires,
Yeah.
volcanoes.
Oh my gosh.
And even tsunamis, right? So we have to think we have a ranger cabin that is definitely in a tsunami zone. So when we see alerts for tsunamis, same thing. What is the procedure to ensure that that staff member is safe? So you have to be paying attention in the summer to like every little thing. I would say that's one of the things that has surprised me most about this job is that you really do have to pay attention to so many different small things because you never know which one is going to pop up and really disrupt what you thought you were going to do that day and how you do the operations of the park.
Yeah, oh my gosh. Well, I know we're nearing the end of our time, and I wanted to just take a second to thank you for diving into your story and sharing a little bit more about just your experience growing up in Alaska and working in Alaska and all the work that you've done for different environmental agencies and stuff like that. A way I like to finish the interviews or a question is, what is something, and we've talked about Lake Clark in a couple of different assets, so I'll be curious what you say. What is something you wish everyone knew about Lake Clark, regardless if they have or haven't been?
I think how Lake Clark, while it might feel very remote, it is still accessible and it will bring you that sense of solitude, even though you are not that far from Anchorage. So it always surprises people when I tell them how close the park is to Anchorage. And when you
Right.
look across Cook Inlet and you see these two iconic volcanoes, Iliamna and Redoubt, that is a national park. You are looking at the viewscape of a national park, and so many people who live here still don't know that. So
Right.
I would say that. And then I would also say, I think I love gardening and wildflowers. And so there's so many parks where people go, especially for that. And between the Cook Inlet side and then the interior part of the park is just, it just is an amazing place for plants. Really good berry picking. But it's
Really?
just what always brings me some joy when I'm going on a hike or a walk or whatever is the diversity of wildflowers that are
Yeah.
in the park and preserve. And so I always tell people, like, while you're looking up at these majestic mountains, also take some time to look down
Yeah,
and
the flowers.
see,
Oh, man.
whether it's the fireweed or the dogwood or the chocolate lilies or what have you. It's Lake Clark is amazing for that.
And what time of year are the wildflowers usually? I would imagine in the summer.
Yes.
Not in January.
Not in January. Nope. There's other great January. Wonderful place to go out and look at the aurora. It is a very dark night skies park, so it's great for that
Oh,
if you're looking
nice.
to take a trip in the winter someplace.
That sounds cold.
It can be cold, but again, we just
But
dress
cool.
for it and it's good.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, I would say anytime June, July, things are always blooming. Always. And then you turn into fall, and that's our sort of fall colors as you look at the changing flowers and plants on the tundra, and it just gives you amazing fall colors.
Oh, man. Yeah. Many of things in our conversation has been like, all right. Every park, every superintendent I talk to, I'm like, okay, great. I can't wait to go there. But the wildflowers will tip me for sure. So,
yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susanne. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. This has been great. And
Yeah,
I look forward to listening to your series. I will learn things
thanks.
too.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been really fun. So I can't complain, honestly.
Well, the Dena'ina word for thank you is Chanan. So I will say Chanan. For spending time with me and learning about this wonderful park and preserve.
Yeah, thanks for sharing about it and just a little bit of piece. It's my first Alaska park that I've gotten to interview, so special in that regard too, of hearing a little bit about a place I candidly don't know that much about. So excited to learn about it. But yeah, again, thanks for your time. It was fun chatting.
You too. It was really lovely talking to you.
Hopefully, what time is it for you?
It's 2:30.
Oh, nice.
We have at least 3 more hours of daylight.
Oh my gosh.
It's not quite like winter yet, but we're getting there. You prepare yourself mentally for those short days.
Well, do you guys have daylight savings? Like, are you gonna?
We do. It's useless in Alaska, but yes, we do.
Again, I grew up in Austin, then I lived in New York for some time, and I would get anxiety, and it's not even to the same level as Alaska, but it's just Austin is such a sunshiny place. And so starting even in September, I would feel nervous for the winter. It was this underlying, no, the sun's going away. So, but I can
see what we were talking about. It's sort of the same thing. You need to figure out what brings you joy in the winter. And I've lived here almost my entire life, and it took me a long time to figure that out. But now it is the night skies, and then also fat biking in the winter. Just is such a great way to get out and see more of Alaska. There's just so many more trails in the winter because everything's frozen, and you can, if you have a fat tire bike, you can ride it a lot of places. And so that makes me not dread winter so much.
Yeah, it brings you joy.
It does bring me a lot of joy.
That was when I went on this backcountry trip. The biggest takeaway for me was I'd never hiked in the winter because, when you're backcountry skiing, you're hiking in the snow. And I was like, it just opened this whole new world because you're all these places that
you can go.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It was amazing. So I could see that. You just have to find the things that you look forward to in that season.
Yep. That's exactly right. And when you go hiking in the winter, you don't have to worry about bears. So.
Oh, true.
Yeah. So
I didn't even think about that. Nice. Good little tidbit. Good to know.
So I can honestly say that I look forward to January and February because that's really great winter biking.
Oh, okay. Nice. That's a fun little tidbit. Who knew?
Yeah.
Love it. Thanks so much for listening today. Our music was composed by Danielle Bees. If you liked this podcast, rate, review, download, and tell your friends about it. This ensures the stories of our national parks and how they are run are shared. Listen to the other episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts or visit us at whorunthispark.com to learn more. I'm Maddie Pellman, and you've been listening to Who Runs This Park.